Somewhere on the western shore of Hudson Bay, there is a building that once ran a third of North America. Not a city, not a capital, a single trading post. At its peak, it controlled the fur trade across an area larger than Western Europe. Today, it stands alone on a muddy riverbank, staffed by Parks Canada in summer and completely empty the rest of the year. This is the York Factory, and it is not even the strangest abandoned place in Manitoba. A Jewish farm colony that vanished without a trace, a dam that powered Winnipeg and now looks like Roman ruins, a psychiatric hospital that started with one 9-year-old boy. Manitoba does not advertise its ghosts, but they are everywhere. 1. York Factory. York Factory is the oldest entry on this list and the most remote. Peak population was in the hundreds during the mid-1800s. The current population is 0. The last Hudson's Bay Company post closed in 1957. The Cree community that had lived around it for generations was relocated. The great building has stood alone ever since. The HBC established York Factory in 1684, where the Hayes River meets Hudson Bay. For nearly 2 centuries, it was the operational headquarters of the most powerful commercial enterprise in North American history. Furs came in. European goods went out. Cree workers were essential to its operation and were paid the least for doing so. When railways replaced the northern shipping routes, York Factory became irrelevant overnight. In 1957, it closed, and the Cree community was relocated to York Landing land they had not chosen and did not know. One Cree elder described it simply: "We did not want to leave. They told us the post was closing, and that was the end of the conversation. We had lived there for generations. That did not matter to anyone making the decision." 2. Old Pinawa Dam. Old Pinawa Dam does not look like Manitoba. It looks like something from Scotland, massive stone ruins sitting in a river valley covered in moss open to the sky. The dam stopped generating power in 1951. The town site was abandoned the same year. The Pinawa Dam was Manitoba's first hydroelectric generating station. Construction began in 1903, about 90 minutes northeast of Winnipeg. Workers earned 10 cents an hour. The terrain was brutal muskeg, granite, -30-degree winters. One generator slipped into a swamp during construction. They pulled it out and kept going. The dam powered Winnipeg for 45 years. When a newer station came online, Pinawa was switched off and left. The workers left. The town site emptied. The concrete stayed. One visitor described it perfectly. "It looks like something ancient, like it has been there 1,000 years. Then you read the sign and realize your grandparents could have watched it being built. That is the strange part. 3. Birtle Residential School. Birtle Residential School is not a ruin in the wilderness. It is a 3-story brick building sitting on a hill overlooking town, visible from the road, operating from 1889 to 1972. More than 7,000 Indigenous children were forced to attend. The building has been abandoned and deteriorating for decades. The school existed to remove Indigenous children from their families, their languages, and their cultures. Siblings were separated. Languages were forbidden. The school farm was worked by the children themselves. 2 of Ray Swan's mother's brothers were taken to Birtle. Neither came home. The federal government sold the building in 1975. A later owner began demolishing the interior and then abandoned the project. The building has sat open to the elements ever since, windows broken, interior vandalized, evidence disappearing year by year. One survivor said it plainly: "That building should not be left to rot quietly. What happened inside it should not be allowed to disappear with the building. We are still here. We remember." 4. Hecla Island Icelandic Village. Hecla Island sits in Lake Winnipeg, 2 hours north of the city. Most visitors go to the resort and the moose. What they walk past are the remnants of an Icelandic fishing community that survived isolation, smallpox, and poverty for generations before quietly fading away. Peak population was a few hundred in the late 1800s. The permanent population today is 0. Icelandic immigrants arrived at Hecla in the 1870s, fleeing volcanic eruptions and famine. They built homes, a church, a school, a community hall, and a commercial fishing operation. For decades, Hecla was a functioning Icelandic-speaking community in the middle of a Canadian lake. Then the children started leaving for Winnipeg. Each generation that left was a generation that did not come back. One descendant described visiting the restored village. "My grandmother spoke Icelandic at home. I do not speak a word of it. Standing there, I felt like I was looking at something I should have inherited and did not." 5. Bender Hamlet. Bender Hamlet is one of the most quietly heartbreaking places on this list because almost nothing remains and almost nobody knows it existed. The peak population was 19 families, about 130 people around 1915. By 1927, the colony was completely abandoned. What is left is a small cemetery, some basement depressions, and a monument made from the stones that once marked the property lines. Jacob Bender organized Manitoba's first Jewish farm colony in the Interlake region in 1903. 19 families built homes, a synagogue, and a school. They were determined to build a self-sufficient Jewish agricultural community on the Canadian prairies. The soil was poor. The isolation was severe. Cattle prices fell. One by one, the families left. One historian described the site as haunting basement depressions and half-hidden graves, where a whole community once tried to build something permanent on land that would not cooperate. The land won, as it usually does. 6. Brandon Mental Health Center. The Brandon Mental Health Center started as something almost darkly comic and ended as something deeply serious. The facility operated from 1890 to the 1990s. Much of the campus is now abandoned. Peak patient population exceeded 1,000 at various points. The story of how it began tells you everything about how institutions like this were actually built. In 1890, a reformatory for boys was constructed overlooking Brandon. It was designed for 45 young offenders. When it opened, it had one occupant, a 9-year-old boy named Billy Mulligan, overseen by a staff of 6. The government repurposed it as a psychiatric hospital almost immediately. For over a century, it expanded. People were committed for reasons ranging from serious illness to circumstances that would not qualify today. Much of the campus was left vacant through the 1990s. One former staff member said it clearly. By the end, there were patients who had been there 40 years. The institution had become the only world they knew. Closing it was never simple. 7. St. Elizabeth. St. Elizabeth is the closest thing to a true ghost town in Manitoba, a place where almost everything that made it a community is gone, and almost no one who does not already know about it will ever find it. Peak population was a few hundred in the early 1900s. The current population is effectively zero. Failed railway access, poor water quality, and the slow erosion of prairie farming communities finished it off over several decades. French settlers founded St. Elizabeth in the late 1800s in the Interlake region. Russian and Hutterite immigrants followed. The community had a church, a school, and the infrastructure of a small but functional prairie village. There was an attempt to bring the railway through. That attempt failed. Without rail access, the economic logic of staying became harder to sustain with each passing decade. The water was the other problem. The wells produced poor quality groundwater. That detail sounds small, but on the prairie it is not a small detail. Clean water is not optional. Families left one by one. The school closed. The church eventually closed. The buildings that remain are deteriorating and marked with graffiti that feels both disrespectful and strangely alive in a place where everything else has gone quiet. One visitor who photographed the site wrote that the graffiti bothered them at first. Then they realized it was the only evidence that anyone under 60 had been there in years. In a ghost town, even vandalism is a sign of life. 8. The Lions House, Carberry. The Lions House near Carberry is not a town. It is a single building, but it earns its place because it has sat empty since 1964, was built by a member of the Manitoba legislature in 1895, and is one of the most photographed abandoned structures on the Canadian prairies. It has been standing empty for over 60 years. Robert Fern Lyons built this house to last. He was a politician and a man of means, and the construction reflected both. By 1964, the house was empty. It has been empty ever since. 6 decades of Manitoba winters have tested it. It is still standing. The prairie sky around Carberry is enormous. The house sits in that landscape like a question mark. One photographer described driving past. You see it from a distance and think someone lives there. Then you get closer. Nobody has lived there in 60 years. It just refuses to fall down. There is something almost stubborn about it. 9. MacArthur's Landing. MacArthur's Landing on Lake Manitoba is a place that served a specific purpose for a specific moment in Manitoba's history, and then had absolutely no reason to exist once that moment passed. The peak population was a small seasonal and working community rather than a permanent settlement. The current population is 0. The landing existed to move people and goods across the lake. Once better routes existed, the landing became irrelevant and was left. In the late 19th century, before road and rail networks covered Manitoba properly, lake transport was essential. MacArthur's Landing was a key transfer point on Lake Manitoba, moving settlers, supplies, and goods across the water. It was not a glamorous place, it was a functional one, the kind of place that exists because geography demands it. Then the railways came. Then the roads. The lake route became unnecessary. The landing was abandoned without ceremony because it had never been a community in any deep sense. It was infrastructure. When the infrastructure was no longer needed, nobody stayed. What remains is minimal traces of the landing, some remnant structures, the lake itself unchanged. The landscape gives no indication that this was once a busy transfer point, connecting settlers to their futures. One local historian described the difficulty of documenting places like MacArthur's Landing. Nobody wrote about it because it was ordinary. It was just where you went to cross the lake. Ordinary places disappear without record because nobody thinks to record the ordinary until it is gone. 10. Victoria Beach Old Estates. Victoria Beach is still an active summer community on the east shore of Lake Winnipeg, but within it are the remains of a much older resort culture grand estate built by Winnipeg's wealthy in the early 1900s, now standing empty and deteriorating among the functioning cottages around them. Many original structures are abandoned and beyond repair. The wealthy families of early Winnipeg built summer retreats here when the city was booming. These were not modest cottages. The Depression hit. Families lost fortunes. The estates changed hands, were subdivided, or were simply left. The community continued around them, but the grandest original structures fell into neglect. One longtime resident described growing up beside one of the abandoned estates. As a child, I thought it was haunted. As an adult, I understand it differently. That house was someone's dream of permanence. The dream ran out before the building did. That happens more than people want to admit. So, there you have it. 10 abandoned places in Manitoba that most people will never find on a postcard. A fur trade empire on a muddy riverbank. A Jewish colony that left only graves. A hospital that began with one 9-year-old boy. A dam that looks like ancient Rome. Real places. Real people. Real losses. If this made you look at Manitoba differently, like, subscribe, and drop your forgotten Manitoba place in the comments.